Good. Well, hello everyone. I think we'll make a start. Hello and welcome to PAI and to our webinar on better regulation and the COVID-19 crisis. I hope you're all keeping safe and well. My name's Claire Cameron, and I'm one of PAI's directors. As some of you may know, Public Administration International is a London-based training and consultancy organisation specialising in strengthening governance worldwide. Our webinar today is a short overview of the principles of better regulation and looking particularly at the aspect of behavioural science or nudge theory, as it's sometimes known, and how some governments are using these approaches during the pandemic. I'm really pleased that Matthew Cox, our regulation and policy expert, is here to talk to you and to discuss a range of these issues. Matthew is the workshop director for our own annual workshop, professional development workshop on better regulation. And he's also involved in some of the consultancy projects that we implement around the world. So when Matthew has finished his presentation, he'll be happy to take questions, although you can, of course, use the question tab on the software throughout and take part in some of the polls that we have up ready. On that point, I think I'd be better off handing to my colleague Amanda, who can now explain how the software works. And then after Amanda's done that, we'll hand to Matthew to run through the session, and I will rejoin you at the end. So thank you very much. Over to you, please, Amanda.
Thank you, Claire. So welcome everyone to our Better Regulations webinar. On the left-hand side of the screen, you will see several boxes. You have a questions box, a poll box, a chat box, and a handouts box. If you have any questions throughout the webinar that you would like to ask Matthew, please do put those questions in the question box. Any technical questions, please use the chat box and I will be on hand to help. Throughout the webinar, we will be launching poll questions, so we will ask you to participate in those, please. If you would like to talk to us or amongst yourselves, please use the chat box and the handouts box. Towards the end of the webinar, you will receive a copy of the slides, some marketing materials from us, and also a recording of the webinar. Matthew, I shall hand this over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Claire and Amanda. My name is Matthew Cox. I worked in a UK government ministry for some years, including in the Better Regulation Executive. And so what I'm really going to do today is share some thoughts and invite questions on what is better regulation. It's a phrase that's become quite fashionable, but what does it really mean? And in particular, how can non-legislative approaches help to support behavioural changes? So I'll have a look at some of the slides as we go along, beginning really with an overview. And what I'm going to cover is the pressures for regulation. I'm sure all of you in your various areas and organizations have experienced this kind of pressure for new regulation to deal with crises or to deal with improvements. So what are the ways to handle those pressures? Can persuasion rather than compulsion work? And obviously with COVID, this is very topical. And what kind of regulatory structures are best? So I'm going to try to at least raise some questions and share some experience in those three areas. And please ask questions as you go along, or indeed at the end, and there'll be opportunities to do that. It's worth reflecting on the fact, as you can see from this quotation, from a review some time ago that there is inevitably political pressure to pass law. Politicians like to address crises, help the population, and to some extent build their own legacy. And you will have seen really throughout modern history that the natural instinct of newspapers is to call for greater protection when things go wrong. So civil servants, agencies, regulators have a lot of pressure and a whole variety of reasons why the population and parliaments want to do more. And there are clearly legitimate reasons to regulate. I mean, there is obviously public health and safety with COVID, with building safety. You may remember, you may have seen in the international press or in the UK press 3 years ago, there was a terrible fire in a tower block in London, Grenfell fire, which led to some very detailed inquiries into what went wrong and how they could be solved. There are economic reasons, protecting people from monopoly behavior, etc. Social reasons, for example, the minimum wage in the United Kingdom, making sure people have an income that's guaranteed to be above a certain level. And of course, climate change, environmental protection. So these are all reasons why politicians, parliaments, and the public expect regulations to be passed. But cumulatively, there is a danger that there will be so many regulations that it will be impractical to understand them all, let alone stick to them. And for example, the report into the Grenfell fire concluded that current regulations and guidance were too complex and unclear, and that could lead to confusion and misinterpretation. So is the stock of existing regulations effective, understood, up to date? What about the flow of new regulations? And crucially, what about the inspection and enforcement of all those regulations? Are people really abiding by them? And who is in charge of making sure that happens? So these are all ways that I can explore with some examples. And obviously, I'd be very interested in your reactions and questions on this. So a way of seeing stock flow and behaviors is really as a kind of jigsaw where the aim of good regulation, better regulation, is to simplify existing regulations, to improve the design of new regulations so that they're clear, easy to implement, etc., and improve enforcement of regulation. In terms of simplifying, one of the ways that the UK has done this, and some other countries have as well, is simply to invite the public, including business, to highlight regulations that are really no longer needed. And here are a couple of examples that have been removed from the UK statute book. The rather long title, Agricultural Produce Grading and Marking Bottled Vegetables Regulations, simply said that when you have bottled vegetables, the vegetables have to fill the bottle. And that was removed on grounds that it's kind of obvious, and the public will just not buy a half-full bottle of vegetables anyway. So Parliament no longer needed to intervene. The Coal and Other Mines Horses Order simply said that you can't ride a horse in a mine. Well, horses are no longer used in mines, and there are very few mines left anyway in the UK, so that was no longer needed. So you can remove redundant legislation, but in reality, people have probably stopped implementing them anyway, just because of the passage of time and things have changed. And so you don't always gain a huge amount by going through the statute book and weeding out the archaic material, although it can be of some use. The real value to business and to the public is often to pick up regulations on their way to being made law or being implemented. And the best way to do that, as recommended by the OECD and others, is impact assessments in order to look at the real costs and benefits of regulations. The impact assessment process is all about identifying proposals that best achieve objectives while minimizing costs and burdens. And nowadays, the UK has decided to go not simply for the costs and benefits for business, but the costs and benefits for wider society as well, to give a balanced opinion on a balanced approach on what actually is being done. And the key questions which government departments and agencies have to answer when they're putting together an impact assessment is, what is the issue being addressed? What are the current or future harms that are being tackled? I mean, that's a kind of repetition of the first question, but it's really looking at what is the problem, and in effect, why is it a problem? And thirdly, why is government best placed to resolve the issue? Very often, Parliament and government, in many countries, I believe, say that only they can solve the problem. But is that realistically the only way to do it? Key questions then have to look at what are the intended outcomes of the intervention? What is the aim? What are the desired effects? What will change as a result? And what will the indicators of success be? So, for example, in a health context, if you have a lockdown where people are not allowed to leave their houses except for a limited range of reasons, what is the intended outcome? What will the effects be, both positive and negative? And how will you measure success? You know, these are central questions to an impact assessment. The recommendations from the OECD and others are that impact assessments should be public. They should be subject to a process of consultation, so that in effect they are a kind of way of governments showing the public what they are working on and why, and inviting comments. So it is really giving the public a sense of what the government's proposing, why it's proposing it, what options it's considered, and which one is preferred, and costs and benefits, obviously. Now, there's a problem here because industry itself is often following the subject concerned, say something like nuclear safety, in great detail, but the public probably isn't. And actually encouraging informed public responses to consultations can be a little bit difficult if people are not alert to what is out there. And so very often government actually is fairly transparent, but only receives a rather limited number of responses. And so that's really a challenge for government communications, to ensure that everyone with an interest in a subject has a fair opportunity, and that the government is at least putting forward options that invite reactions that will then be taken into account when the government finally decides what to do. I've mentioned the impact assessment system as the kind of prelude to regulating by parliamentary legislation, but the UK and now the European Union have been looking recently at alternatives to regulation. These are not simply behavioural, but things like self-regulation, so that a particular sector or industry might well go for a kind of code of conduct that it imposes on itself in order to embed best practice. So, for example, gas safety in the UK is largely self-regulated, but there is some underlying legislation to ensure that the industry is following the necessary guidance. Similarly, the advertising industry in the UK is very largely self-regulated. You can inform and educate consumers. So, for example, if there is a strong environmental need, for example, to follow fair trade principles, you may find it difficult within trade policy rules to simply say all imports have to be fairly traded. But you can say, well, this is what a fair trade label looks like, and this is the advantage of following fair trade principles. And that is a kind of information and education process rather than an import ban. You can use economic instruments, classically emissions trading, in order to encourage business to operate a kind of emissions auction market, which will encourage technology that reduces emissions, etc. Or you can provide subsidies for new technologies. And a final alternative is actually not to intervene at all, which may seem a slightly strange approach, but very often all the instruments are there already. They simply haven't been applied, or they haven't been fully developed. So, for example, scrap metal theft is a problem in the UK, elsewhere I suspect as well. But there's already at least 2 pieces of primary UK legislation dealing with exactly the problem, that scrap metal dealers sometimes accept stolen scrap without investigating where it came from. And so there is already the powers needed. You don't need to legislate again. You need to implement the powers. One of the reasons why impact assessment began in the first place was to reduce the burdens on business. I think that's now moved on a little bit towards just looking at overall costs and benefits. But the UK has tried over the last 10 years or so to, in effect, increase the value of impact assessments by ensuring that for every new regulation, an equivalent burden on business is removed. Now, you can see from this progression that it began as introduce a new regulation and you have to remove that amount of burden. But it was then doubled to you have to remove twice that and then 3 times that burden. But because of the Grenfell fire, that has now been suspended. There'll be a new target announced this December by the government. But the feeling was that if you kept putting pressure on people to remove 3 times the regulatory burden for each new regulation, there would be a problem if you then began taking out essential regulations on construction, etc. So that there is at the moment something of an informal moratorium on removing 3 times the amount of existing regulation. Okay. The other way in order to help manage the flow of new regulation is a UK initiative, not a new initiative, it was launched 15 years ago, but it's still running, which is that any new regulations should only be introduced on 2 dates each year, 1st of April, 1st of October, with the idea of providing information to business on a kind of package of all those regulations, rather than scattering new regulations throughout the year. And this, I think, has been welcomed by business organizations because they have seen that they can produce their own summaries and digests of what's coming. And to some extent, it underlines to business how much new regulation is arriving, but at the same time, how much previous regulation has been removed. So, for example, I'm self-employed. There used to be a requirement for the self-employed to produce health and safety risk assessments for themselves, for their own workspace, and that's been removed on grounds that it would be kind of common sense that you would look after your own health and safety without needing to write it down in a formal process. So that leaves the enforcement of regulation, as I mentioned. And there was a report by Philip Hampton who concluded that enforcement affects business at least as much as the policy itself. In other words, inspection and penalties for getting it wrong. And he envisaged that the average population of businesses across a sector tend to fall into three categories. There's a broad central category of businesses that probably know what they ought to be doing, but may not know in detail, or may simply have overlooked some requirement. And that is a kind of potentially compliant majority of businesses. But on one side, there's the kind of naturally compliant minority that check the rules and implement them. And on the other side, a non-compliant minority that simply decide to ignore the rules and hope to get away with it and don't respond to reminders and letters, etc. So the idea really is that a good regulator should kind of divide the population of businesses they're regulating reasonably informally based on feedback into those categories, because then enforcement action can be focused on the non-compliant rather than constantly inspecting the naturally compliant and using fairly light touch reminders for the potentially compliant rather than simply penalizing them. Okay, so really the first section was how to deal with the pressure for regulation, how to reduce existing regulation where possible, but not where existing regulation is essential, for example, building safety, and how to use impact assessment to kind of slow down the process to some extent and make sure that there is an effective policy debate. Okay, my second section is about persuasion rather than compulsion. And this is all about focusing on what might be called real-world behaviors, working with public preferences, and preserving individual freedom of choice. Now, that all sounds rather vague and general, but it's perhaps easier to give some examples. So the behavioural insight team in the UK have said that if you want to encourage a behaviour, you make it easy, attractive, social, and timely. The idea being that people don't tend to respond to overcomplicated or difficult to follow instructions, but they will follow something that's easy, attractive, social, and timely. So a very simple requirement to wash your hands can be made very complicated. In fact, there are 7 different steps to washing your hands, and the Behavioural Insight Unit trialled instructing people as to the 7 steps, or simply instructing people as to 4 steps rather, or simply telling people to wash their hands. And they discovered that perhaps, as you might imagine, requiring people to follow all 7 steps tended to lead to reduced response to hand washing because it was seen as just too complicated. You haven't got time to do all 7 steps in that order. Whereas 4 steps acted as a reasonable reminder that it's not simply rub your palms together, you have to check your thumbs, etc. And that was slightly better than simply telling people to wash their hands. And so there was a sort of middle position, which was the best approach, even to something as straightforward as that. Similarly, if you want to slow down drivers, you can simply say, well, there's a speed limit and you'll be fined for breaking it. But other ways people have discovered in transport is to give people a kind of micro reward for being within the speed limit, which is the smiley face you can see on the left, creating an illusion that there might be some obstacle coming up, which is the middle picture, which I find personally rather scary because I'd probably slam on the brakes if I thought that those are three-dimensional, but they are in fact illusions. And training people as they drive. And this is a series of markings on British motorways where people are instructed for a period of miles to keep at least two chevrons, as they're called, apart. And research has shown that the effect of practicing staying apart lasts for maybe 10 or so miles after the training has ended, but that people are kind of subtly being told that that is about the right distance just by practicing it as you are on a real motorway driving along. And these are all measures which are not requiring penalties. They are kind of working with the grain of behavior, I guess you would say. Okay. Finally, I'm going to cover regulatory structures briefly. And I certainly will come back to questions in a moment. Actually, just before we leave the question of behavioral insight, what I'd like to do is just start a quick poll for you to see how convinced you are that this is a good plan as opposed to using regulation itself. So the questions are essentially, should governments use this kind of behavioral science in their approach? Really, that's what I'd invite your views on. You know, it's a good idea, bad idea, just a very quick feeling about that. So I'll give you a minute or so just to respond if you think that's a worthwhile approach. Okay, I'm just looking at the results in real time. Looks as if it's a majority for yes at the moment. So let me show those results so far. Definitely a majority for yes, but not universal. So that's interesting. It is just a yes/no question. There's a lot in behavioral science in the sense that I think it would be fair to say that some of it feels a little bit manipulative and some of it feels entirely sensible. And it's a little bit case by case. For example, if you wanted to get people to opt in to saving for a pension, do you simply say, well, you have to save unless you opt out? Or do you say it's entirely voluntary and you can opt in? And to cut a long story short, the UK has chosen the you will save unless you opt out approach to employee savings. And that has increased the number of people saving for their pensions. But it is, in a sense, arranging things so that it is more difficult to opt out than it would otherwise be. Okay, let me move on to regulatory structures. And again, I think there are three very open questions here. First of all, is national or local regulation best? And at the moment, this is a very lively debate in the UK because we are four kingdoms here, not one, or four devolved administrations, as they're called in the jargon, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And each of those devolved administrations has its view on what it should do for health, education, the environment, etc. But there have to be some national rules, not least because only the UK as a whole can enter into international obligations on behalf of the four parts of the United Kingdom. So at what level is regulation best organized? Secondly, and this is a kind of linked question, should regulation be run by central government or by what are called arm's length bodies? In other words, bodies that are not ministerial departments reporting directly to the cabinet, but separate agencies, separate organizations with responsibility for a particular area, linked by a kind of dotted line to the state, but not actually part of the ministerial approach. And how best can you ensure operational independence of those institutions? So there was a very long-running case in Jamaica where the minister issued a direction to the utilities regulator, and the utilities regulator actually challenged it in the courts as going beyond the minister's general power to issue directions and too close to affecting the operational independence of that particular authority. And the appeal went right to the Privy Council, and they decided that the authority had got it right and that the minister had gone beyond the powers that Parliament had given them to intervene. So just to give you one example, and I know several of you are involved in the regulation of water and the water industries. The Office of Water Regulation in the UK regulates the water sector. It has a variety of duties. It's got to protect consumers, it's got to secure long-term water supply, and it's got to ensure that the privatized companies that are effectively privatized monopolies carry out their functions and can finance them. So some of those, on the face of it, appear to be in conflict, but the aim of Ofwat, which is, as I say, an arm's length body, is to try to balance all those various obligations against each other. They're paid for by a levy on the water industry, but they have to handle that as they can't allow that to affect their relations with the industry, and they can be given general instructions by the ministerial level in the UK, but they can't be managed day to day by ministers because they have a degree of independence. They have a chief executive, but they also have a board, and so the idea is some sort of continuity of policy rather than change with each new Director General. Okay, I'm going to ask one more polling question, really, which is that regulation can be managed directly by ministers and their departments, or it can be managed by what I've described as arm's length bodies. So, which, again, straightforward choice in a sense, but it's actually, it would depend, I guess, from case to case. But which approach do you personally think is the best one in terms of handling, especially utility regulation? So I'll allow you a minute or so for responding to that question. I should add, while you're voting, that there is no absolute template for this in the UK. In fact, there have been functions that the government has given to an arm's length agency and has then taken back, and vice versa. So it does tend to depend on what works, what doesn't. I can see from the voting that your own preferences are more for arm's length than for a government ministry. I'll show you the results so far. And there is even a third possibility where the Office of Telecommunications was changed from being part of the civil service to being an independent corporation, simply because of pressure on getting the right experts in within civil service pay scales. Okay, I've covered as much as I can in the time available. So really, I think it's over to you to ask questions or comment, etc. So very welcome to hear those.
Okay, so I've got the first question from Zamira, and the question is, what are your thoughts in considering simplifying regulations or in deregulating using a cost-benefit analysis?
Yes, thank you for that, Zamira. I think that it's always worth trying to come up with an effective cost-benefit analysis and to simplify existing regulations. And one of the things that has been done in the UK is to ask whether the whole regulation is needed any longer. So there used to be a regulation that you had to have a license for owning a dog. You had to go to the post office and buy a license for dog ownership, and that was abolished on grounds that it wasn't really achieving anything. It didn't really tell you very much. So that's an example of removing a regulation on grounds that its benefit really was very small, and its cost was not worth it.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. The second question is from Rachel, and she is saying that she is a legislative drafter from the Kenya Law Reform Commission, and in Kenya they have a statute that has been widened the bodies that can make regulation. So she wants to know, what are your views on this? And sorry, we will still have to push and pull between regulation making bodies and the cabinet secretaries of the parliament.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I mean, that's very tricky. In the UK, as far as I know, these arm's length and independent bodies can issue guidance, but they can't produce anything that creates new penalties, for example. Only Parliament could do that. And what happens is that they would then ask the relevant part of the government machine to come forward with secondary legislation where possible. Otherwise, it might need to be primary legislation. I think if you allow too many individual bodies to produce binding legislation, you do risk complicating the whole picture. So I remember when I looked at the state subsidy rules in the European Union, there's a collection of them which runs to 926 pages, which is so complex that I do wonder if people can really find their way through them. So I think it's a matter of locating the material and Rachel, you've added a comment, which is that it's how the Statutory Instruments Act is drafted. I mean, the UK Parliament has committees in the House of Commons and the House of Lords which look at the quality of statutory instruments, but they don't have the power to do very much second guessing of the underlying policy. And there are literally hundreds of statutory instruments going through, so it's a matter of bringing them to the attention of Parliament, of the public, when they are directly relevant to business, etc. I think all I'd say is that there is a communication challenge in making sure people know what's being agreed by statutory instrument or by other secondary legislation. Brian, you've asked for the citation of the Privy Council decision. I will be looking that up while we speak. Are you? Apologies for the slight delay. Do let me know if you have other questions.
Matthew, while you're searching, this is Claire back again. One of our participants, Mehdi, missed the answer to the first poll question, but I've relayed that. But the question is, what do you think about that? What's your own view about whether governments should use behavioural insights or nudge approaches?
Sure. I mean, I think I would say mildly nervous about it. It can feel a bit manipulative. It can, when it's a bit like a magician, you know, when the way the trick is performed by a magician is revealed, people sometimes feel, well, that was a bit manipulative. So I don't know. It can be useful. I think if it's clearly explained to people, and you know, this is how it works, this is why we've done it this way, people feel perhaps less manipulated. So I think it can work, but with care. I mean, let me give you an example. When you fill in your tax return, it used to have a box at the end saying, "What I have said is honest," and you know, I stand by it. It now has a box at the beginning saying, "What I am about to say will be honest." And the behavioural insight team concluded that had more of an effect on people at the beginning than at the end. Well, logically, it should have the same effect whether it's at the beginning or the end. But it was using psychology to say that promising to be honest is more effective than claiming you have been honest, if you see what I mean. So I think it all depends on the context. But I certainly don't mind seeing a smiley face if I'm within the speed limit. I have just posted the web link to the case I referenced, which was Mossel Jamaica Limited versus the Office of Utilities Regulations, Privy Council Appeal 79 of 2009. It's an interesting case, in my view. Are there any further questions?
I think, Matthew, that probably that's all the questions that I can see that have been asked so far, unless anybody's got any final quick questions.
I believe there's another question through from Brian, and he's asking, what are the advantages and disadvantages of having arm's length bodies do the functions of government departments?
Yeah, thanks very much, Brian. I mean, I think, first of all, it is a way of concentrating long-term expertise and corporate memory in a way that is more difficult with the more generalist approach in the UK civil service of moving around different subject areas. Secondly, I think it does help in some cases to take the politics out of individual decisions. So, for example, on food safety, there is a balance between public safety and the interests of food producers, which can become political. And it's, I think, the UK experience that leaving it to a non-political body, the Food Standards Agency, has tended to work well. It enables ministers to stand back from the detail, and it also enables the experts in the Food Standards Agency to address the problem more rapidly, perhaps, than if it required ministerial direct involvement. But there are disadvantages in that it can lead to quite a complex audit trail between Parliament, ministers, chief executives of these bodies, and the public.
Thank you, Matthew. I think that's all of the Oh, no, we have one more that's just come through. This is from Mehdi. So in Botswana, they had problems of placing the RIA office. Where do you recommend it to be placed? Ministry of Investment and Trade, Ministry of Presidency, and which professionals are more appropriate to lead the uni?
Yes, thank you very much, Mehdi. Well, the UK has had exactly this, I won't say problem, I'd say experience. There's no right answer, but the UK experience was that, first of all, it was in the Cabinet Office, which was effectively the, I think, the equivalent of your Ministry of the Presidency. And it was moved because it became rather big, a bit too big for the centre, and it was moved to the Department of Business, where it still is. I think, looking back, it was better positioned in the centre, because within a ministry, it tends to be another ministry that has less power over all the other ministries than if it was at the centre of government. So views vary, but I think at the centre of government you can have a cross-cutting unit that deals with better regulation. And in terms of professions, probably economists would be the most directly relevant to impact assessment. To some extent, accountants and lawyers, but I would say that it's a largely economic approach in a broad sense, as well as policy people to look at what works.
Thank you, Matthew. We've just had one more question, and this is from John. In the small states, it is important to avoid legislating so that a lot of subsidiary instruments are needed. The alternatives you mentioned, persuasion, economic incentives, etc., are useful in such a context. Too many small states are toothless tigers with inadequate subledge. Do you agree?
It's hard to generalize, isn't it? But I certainly think, as a general principle, it is good to think about day-to-day interactions with government, and to think about whether business and the general public can actually locate the regulations, and whether they are easy to follow, easy to abide by. And I think that you can have a combination of law, but also persuasion and communication. So it all depends. But I agree that an over-complex statute book can simply be self-defeating and difficult to follow. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, everyone.
I think that's it for the questions for now. So if you want to carry on, you can.
Well, I think that let me just try to sum up what I've covered. I think that just to look at the whole picture of regulation. I think firstly, I've described the pressures for regulation and the fact that it is best to have some kind of filter that government can run in a coordinated way that looks at whether new regulation is genuinely needed, and if so, what will it achieve? And that's the kind of impact assessment approach. Secondly, is it really worth new legislation? Will it be followed? Will it be effective? Or is it better to have public information, persuasion, and some other softer, shall we say, form of government action? And thirdly, what is the best regulatory structure? Is it best to have a part of central government that can take action immediately, or is it best to have some kind of specialized arm's length body whose independence is to some extent protected, who can't be directly told day to day by ministers what to do, but can be given general policy directions and will be subject to a kind of general parliamentary oversight. So those are really some of the current questions on regulation. I think to bring it right up to date with COVID, there's a lot of interesting analysis at the moment as to what works. Is it best to have heavy fines for people who break the rules? Is it necessary to have what have been called COVID marshals in the UK to check on people's behaviour? Or is it better simply to highlight the advantages of isolating effectively and following all best guidance, and the human cost of not doing so, rather than saying that it's a criminal matter if you misbehave and don't follow the rules? Or do you need a kind of balanced ticket involving all the instruments of government? And so I think that, again, is something that is very current here, I'm sure in all of your countries as well, and will be analysed for some time to come in terms of what works. So I'll stop there, I think, and hand back to Claire and Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I think Amanda's just going to make me visible again, for better or for worse. All right. Good. Well, Matthew, thanks so much. Really, really good, and some really interesting examples that you've shared with us. And a big thank you to those of you who've asked all those interesting and rather difficult questions. Well done, Matthew, on tackling those. I was just going to mention to you that, well, you see, I think on the slides, some of our workshops that are coming up, both face-to-face, we hope. I mean, our normal program of workshops is, that take place in London has obviously had to be suspended since March, but we're very much hoping that things will get back to something like normal in the new year. We have a full program for 2021 being mapped out, and I think information is already available on our website, so please keep an eye on that. But we are also offering some virtual workshops as well. Matthew, your workshop with us, Better Regulation, which is a one-week program here in London, is due to take place in March, and they usually provide a really nice opportunity to network and benchmark and visit some UK practitioners and share experiences in that very practical way. We also have one on behavioural insights and nudge theory called Better Policies, Better Lives. So that's taking place, I think, in around August. So remains really to say once again, thank you so much for joining us, and I've certainly enjoyed it. I hope you have as well. And I want to say again a big thank you to you, Matthew, and also to you, Amanda. Thank you very much for organising us all. And enjoy the rest of your day. And I hope you all keep safe and well, and that we may have a chance of actually seeing each other face to face before too long. So thank you again. We'll say goodbye for now. Thank you.
Thank you.